Okay, let's dive in. Welcome, everyone. We're digging into the news from one specific day, June 11, 2025.
Right. We've got a pile of sources here, reports, articles, summaries.
And our goal is really to cut through the noise, find the key insights, and maybe see how things connect, from U.S. politics to what's happening globally, even some science.
Exactly. It's like a snapshot, but one that hopefully reveals some bigger trends playing out.
So let's jump right in. And honestly, June 11th kicked off with some real tension here in the U.S.
Yeah, the big domestic story was definitely the fallout from those federal immigration raids the Friday before,
Right.
especially in Los Angeles.
And the reaction was, well, immediate. Protests erupted. Sources painted a really tense picture in L.A. on the 11th. We're talking police using tear gas, rubber bullets, flashbangs.
Wow.
Yeah, curfews too. And the reports mentioned 197 arrests and multiple injuries just that day. It sounds like things were pretty volatile.
It certainly sounds that way. And crucially, the reports show this wasn't just an LA thing. The protests spread.
Oh, right. Where else?
Well, the sources mentioned New York, Chicago, D.C., San Antonio, Spokane, Seattle, Vegas, Austin. Quite a few major cities saw similar scenes. Some had curfews and police action, too.
Okay. And then President Trump's response to L.A. specifically, that seemed to really up the ante.
It did. According to the sources, by Monday, he'd mobilized around 4,000 National Guard troops.
And Marines too, wasn't it?
Yeah, about 700 U.S. Marines as well. Sent them into the city.
And the official reason given.
The stated mission was to protect federal properties and federal agents during these ongoing immigration operations.
Okay, so that's where the legal fight comes in, right? With Governor Newsom.
Exactly. That's a huge part of this. Sources highlight Governor Newsom is challenging that deployment in court. He's trying to get a restraining order.
To stop the troops from being used in, actual law enforcement roles within California.
Precisely. And the sources said a federal judge in San Francisco was actually scheduled to hear arguments on that very issue today, on Thursday, June 11th.
So, pulling all that together, the raids, the protests spreading, the federal troops, the court challenge, what are the main impacts or takeaways the sources are pointing to?
Well, first off, just deploying those troops has really fired up the whole national debate about using military forces domestically.
Right, and the federal government versus state authority.
That's a big one. And this legal battle Newsom started. It could genuinely set precedents for how and when federal troops can be sent into states, especially without the state asking for them.
And the sources mentioned the different viewpoints on why Trump acted.
Absolutely. According to the reports, the president framed it as necessary to stop things from descending into chaos.
But critics.
Critics, yeah, they were warning about federal overreach, potential threats to civil liberties when you bring in the military like that.
And it feels like this just deepens the existing divides, doesn't it? Especially around immigration and using force like this.
Totally. It's pouring gasoline on that fire, really. And, the sources also mention the very real human side, the fear and tension this creates in immigrant communities nationwide. It's a complex, high-stakes situation developing fast.
Okay, let's shift from sort of street-level confrontations to tension in a different arena, the media. There was another story on June 11th highlighting friction with the administration.
Ah, yes, the ABC News story. With Terry Moran, the correspondent.
Right. According to the reports, he was terminated.
He was, and the reason cited...
Sources say it was over a post on X, what they called a scathing critique of President Trump and Stephen Miller. He apparently called them world-class haters.
He did delete the post, apparently, but ABC's statement, based on the sources, talked about breaching objectivity and professionalism standards.
They also mentioned his contract was ending soon anyway.
They did note that.
What?
But what adds another layer is that administration officials, like Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, had publicly called for him to be suspended or fired after that post went up.
So it's really more than just one tweet. Kind of throws a spotlight on that whole tense relationship between the press and this administration.
It does, and raises questions about, journalistic independence, what's okay for reporters to say on social media, and how much political pressure might influence newsroom decisions.
Yeah, it definitely highlights the tricky line news outlets have to walk with their journalists' online presence, especially covering politics, and, well, the pressure from officials commenting directly.
Exactly, a complex dynamic.
Okay, switching gears pretty dramatically now. Let's move from media issues to a really significant policy change with global reach.
That would be Secretary of State Rubio's announcement about USAID.
Right. On June 11th, he announced they plan to close all overseas offices of USAID.
All of them. by September 30th, 2025.
Wow. What's the background there?
Well, the sources say it follows a Trump executive order and also a review back in March that already cut, 83% of U.S. side programs.
Yeah, that sounds right.
So this seems to be the final step. The official reasons given were inefficiency in programs not aligning with current U.S. interests.
And where does oversight for foreign aid go now?
It's shifting directly to the State Department itself, according to the plan.
All overseas offices.
Mm-hmm.
That just sounds huge. What are the immediate impacts mentioned?
It is huge. We're talking hundreds of employees affected in over 100 countries. Sources are calling this a major, maybe even unprecedented shift in U.S. foreign aid policy.
And the criticism. What are the potential downsides highlighted?
Well, critics quoted in the sources are worried this could seriously reduce American influence in humanitarian work and development globally. They're concerned about the impact on vulnerable people who depend on these programs, and also that it weakens U.S. soft power, the ability to influence through attraction, not just force. It's seen as dismantling a long-standing part of U.S. foreign policy.
Okay, let's swing back home now to electoral politics, a way to kind of gauge the mood.
Yeah.
New Jersey held its gubernatorial primaries on June 11th.
Right, and these are being watched pretty closely. New Jersey can sometimes be a bellwether, offering clues about national trends before the 2026 midterms.
And the current governor, Phil Murphy, he's term limited, so it's an open race.
Exactly. On the Democratic side, the sources listed quite a field. You had Rep. Mikey Sherrill as the frontrunner, Josh Gottheimer, Ross Baraka from Newark, Steve Fulop from Jersey City, Sean Spiller from the NJEA, and Steve Sweeney, the former Senate president.
That's a lot of candidates.
It is. And for the Republicans, the main name mentioned is Jack Ciattarelli.
He ran before, right? Came close against Murphy.
Very close in 2021, and significantly, he got Trump's endorsement for this primary.
So the results aren't just about who wins the nomination in Jersey. What are the bigger implications people are talking about?
Well, obviously, it sets up the general election, which could be competitive, even though Jersey leans blue. But more broadly, analysts are going to pick apart these results, looking for signs about how voters feel about Trump-era policies right now.
And maybe how Democrats are strategizing against that.
Exactly. You see those divisions in the Democratic field. And for Republicans, it's a clear shot at trying to flip a governorship. It's like a mini version of the national political fight playing out.
Okay, back overseas now. Let's start with something that definitely signaled rising tensions.
The U.S. embassy situation in Iraq.
Yeah, what happened there on the 11th?
The State Department issued an ordered departure for non-essential staff from the embassies in Baghdad and Erbil.
Okay.
And they also authorized dependents to leave voluntarily from Bahrain and Kuwait, too.
You don't do that lightly. What was the trigger? Sources linked it to Iran.
Directly. It came amid rising tensions over those stalled nuclear talks with Iran, and there were specific threats mentioned from Iran's defense minister threatening U.S. bases if the talks failed. Okay, so it's directly tied to the nuclear issue.
Absolutely, and the impact. Fewer U.S. diplomats on the ground, obviously.
Right, which could actually limit diplomatic options right when you need them, and we saw an immediate market reaction. Brent crude oil jumped about 4%. Markets hate that kind of uncertainty.
Yeah, it definitely shows how linked geopolitics and markets are. And, well, it just raises the risk of actual military confrontation in the Gulf.
Sadly, yes, with potential ripple effects across the region.
Which brings us neatly to the core issue. Those U.S.-Iran nuclear talks.
Which are coming up very soon. The 6th round was scheduled for Sunday, June 15th in Oman.
And the goal is still to replace the old deal, the JCPOA.
That's the aim. Replace the 2015 deal that Trump pulled the U.S. out of during his first term.
And the positions. Sources laid out Trump's pretty clearly.
Yeah, his stance is firm. Iran shouldn't get nuclear weapons, and any new deal has to ban uranium enrichment entirely.
And Iran's view.
Well, their foreign minister, Arachi, was quoted sounding somewhat optimistic about a deal, but crucially one that would allow them to keep enriching uranium just under IAEA supervision.
But the timing here is tricky, isn't it? With the IAEA finding Iran non-compliant recently.
Incredibly tricky. That IAEA board decision finding them non-compliant just happened.
And didn't Iran announce something after that vote?
They did. Plans for a new enrichment facility, which, really complicates trying to negotiate limits on their program. The outcome of these talks is just massive for Middle East security and global non-proliferation.
Okay, moving to a different part of the world now, the Arctic. There was news out of Denmark.
Yes, involving the U.S. military. Denmark's parliament passed a law on June 11th allowing the U.S. to set up military bases on Danish soil.
This builds on an earlier agreement, right? about air bases.
It does. A 2023 deal gave U.S. troops access to Danish air bases. This expands on that.
And sources connect this to renewed U.S. focus on Greenland.
Right. Greenland, which is Danish territory, seen as strategic and mineral-rich.
How did the vote go in Denmark?
Passed pretty comfortably, 94 in favor, 11 against. It just needs the royal sign-off now.
And there was a comment from the Danish foreign minister about Greenland.
Yes. Lars Løkke Rasmussen made a point of saying Denmark could cancel the deal if the U.S. ever tried to annex Greenland. So, addressing that sensitivity directly.
Interesting. So the impact is a stronger U.S. military footprint in the Arctic, strengthening NATO's northern flank.
That's the strategic upside mentioned in the sources, yes.
But what about downsides or criticisms?
Well, critics within Denmark raised concerns about compromising national sovereignty by having foreign bases. And importantly, leaders in Greenland itself have repeatedly and very clearly rejected any idea of U.S. ownership. So while the alliance gets stronger, those underlying political sensitivities about Greenland remain.
Okay, let's pivot from geopolitics to the economy. A story about an airline shutdown.
Ah, Silver Airways. Yes, that happened abruptly on June 11th.
A small Florida-based airline. Right, to stop flying.
Completely. Ceased all operations. Passengers were told via Instagram not to even go to the airport.
Wow, that's sudden. What led up to it?
Well, they'd filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy back in December, reportedly with over $500 million in debt.
Okay.
Their assets were sold to a holding company, Wexford Capital Argentum Acquisition, and that company decided not to keep the airline running.
So what did the shutdown affect specifically? Planes, jobs, routes?
Sources mentioned their fleet of 8 ATR turboprops was grounded. Around 348 employees were laid off, unfortunately. And their service ended that covered 5 Florida hubs and about 11 destinations in the Caribbean and islands.
So immediate chaos for passengers needing refunds or new flights.
Definitely. And questions about whether competitors, maybe their subsidiary Seaborne Airlines, will pick up those routes.
And bigger picture concerns.
Yeah, it raises worries about how financially fragile these smaller regional carriers might be, especially in tough times, and what that means for air travel access to smaller communities that depend on them.
Okay, last stop for today. Let's shift focus completely out to space. A big science announcement on June 11th.
This was really cool. The ESA NASA Solar Orbiter mission released the first ever images taken from a high latitude over the sun's south pole.
First ever. That sounds significant. Why is seeing the balls so hard, and why does it matter?
It is significant. It's really tough to get a spacecraft out of the flat plane where the planets orbit the ecliptic to look down on the poles.
How do they manage it?
The orbiter used gravity assists from Venus, basically swinging by Venus multiple times to change its orbit and tilt it relative to the sun's equator. These images were from March, when it was tilted about 17 degrees.
And what did they see down there?
Really chaotic-looking magnetic fields, mixed polarities, north and south magnetic poles jumbled together. That was a key finding.
What instruments captured this?
Sources mentioned PHI for mapping magnetism, EUI for imaging the super hot outer atmosphere, the corona, and SPICE-E for analyzing composition and temperature. They work together to give this detailed picture.
So scientifically, what does seeing this polar chaos help us figure out?
It's huge for understanding the sun's 11-year activity cycle, including how its main magnetic field flips. The poles are key drivers of that whole process.
And does it relate to why the sun's atmosphere is so hot?
It likely does. That's a big puzzle, why the corona is millions of degrees hotter than the surface. The dynamics at the poles probably play a major role in heating it and driving the solar wind.
You mentioned space weather prediction earlier. How does this connect?
Right. What happens at the poles affects the whole solar system. Understanding the polar fields and the solar cycle better helps us predict things like solar flares and coronal mass ejections, big bursts of energy from the sun.
Which can affect us here on Earth.
Exactly. They can impact satellites, communications, even power grids. So better forecasting means we can prepare better.
And what's next for Solar Orbiter? More polar views.
Yeah, it'll keep using Venus flybys to get into even more tilted orbits, giving us higher latitude views over time. The sources say this ongoing imaging is crucial as the sun heads towards its next activity peak, solar maximum. It'll really help improve our models and forecasts. It's a long-term investment in both basic science and practical technology.
Wow. So just recapping June 11th, 2025, we went from tense domestic standoffs and legal fights over federal power
to high-stakes nuclear diplomacy, shifting alliances in Europe, and airlines suddenly collapsing.
and then getting the first actual look at the sun's south pole It's quite a range in a single day.
It really underscores how interconnected everything is, doesn't it?
Oh.
Sometimes in ways you don't immediately see. Domestic politics impact global affairs. Scientific discoveries have real-world applications.
Definitely. And maybe a final thought for you, our listener, based on all this. Consider how these strategic decisions playing out today, deploying forces domestically, tearing down foreign aid structures, negotiating nuclear deals or military pacts, how these aren't just headlines for June 11th. These moves could fundamentally change geopolitical balances, global influence, maybe even how we deal with things like space weather years down the line. It's worth thinking about those longer ripples, the ones you might not see in the immediate news cycle.